Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about security settings that you can apply to project elements and also to workflows. Before we get started with that, I want to look at the security permissions that have to do with project elements and financial documents. So as a lot of you probably know, there are specific permissions for a user or a group to view financial documents or to edit financial documents, so that can either be granted or denied. And that's for all things that we consider financial documents in Flex, like a quote or an invoice, anything else where finance or money is involved. So that would not include things like a pull sheet or a manifest. And then we also have a general system-wide permission for can view project elements. And that would be any element in the system, including quotes, pull sheets, crew lists, invoices, etc. And you can either have that granted or denied per user or per security group. A lot of times this is typically always granted can view project elements because there's not a whole lot that people can do in Flex without this granted. If you have just a shop tech who needs to work with pull sheets, then you probably want this granted, even though he's never going to view a financial document. Really, like I said, there's not a whole lot you can do without being able to view project elements. And so that's where today's topic is going to come in, where you can actually go and change the individual security settings per element. So you can view project elements granted for a user, but then you can go and fine tune which elements or which project elements they can actually view. The way that we can do that is by going to the projects menu, then project elements. And let's start by looking at the settings for the quote. So we'll double click on quote. And we'll go to the security tab. And so you'll see that there are quite a few different options here, and we're just going to look at a couple of them. The first two that we have here are view groups and edit groups. And basically the way that you'll set this up is that any box for any security group that you check, then they will become the only groups that are able to view this particular element. So for example, if I were to check only accounting and administrators can view quotes, then anybody else who logs in who's not a member of either of these groups will not be able to view quotes at all. If you still want anybody to be able to view a quote but not be able to edit the quote, then you would check the edit group boxes. So this way, if they have can view project elements and can view financial documents granted in their security permission settings, then they will be able to view because no boxes are checked here, but they won't be able to edit unless they're members of either of these two particular groups. Of course, after any changes that you make sure you click update so that those changes will take effect. Another popular one that I see a lot of people using, if you scroll down a little bit, you will see the not responsible person settings. The responsible person is actually found if you go to your contact associations for the element. You can see that the responsible person by default is set up as the account manager. You might have had that changed in your system and you might call this something else, but most people will still call it the account manager. And so that will be the responsible person for this element. Whichever contact, typically an employee contact entry, is input into the responsible person or account manager field for a quote, they are the responsible person. And what these settings will do, this basically is saying if you aren't the responsible person or if you don't belong to either of these groups, then you will not be able to view the quote. And so what this is saying is that, let's say there's somebody who belongs to the sales reps group, they create a quote and they're the responsible person. So they'll be able to view their own quote, but they won't be able to view anybody else's quote if they're not the responsible person because we do not have sales rep checked in the view group. So only the responsible person and those people who belong to these security groups will be able to view the quote. And again, just like above, we have an edit group as well. So I could say that only administrators in accounting can edit all quotes, but only the responsible person can edit their own quotes. And then this is, I believe this is a little bit of a newer one. We have the corporate identity, or the corresponding corporate identity view groups. And basically this one is set up so that if you were to begin a new quote, or if you have a quote that is assigned to a particular corporate identity. Oops, I actually don't have corporate identities activated on this. Let me activate that really fast. So if I create a new quote and I choose a particular corporate identity, so let's say that I choose my Flex Video Solutions for this one. If there's a user whose default corporate identity is not Flex Video Solutions, then they would not be able to view that quote. So for example, this user is defaulted to Flex Rental Solutions. So let's go back to the security settings. And I would say anybody who does not belong to the corporate identity of the quote cannot view the quote or edit the quote unless they belong to one of these particular groups. And then we also have the non-corresponding corporate identity calendar groups. And this will say that if there's a particular quote that is assigned to a certain corporate identity, and then you have a user that's not assigned to the corporate identity of that quote, then this will say that those quotes won't even show up in their calendar unless they belong to one of these groups. So again, just to clarify, if there's somebody who's assigned to the shop text group and their default corporate identity is Flex Rental Solutions, if I have a quote that is for Flex Video Solutions, then that quote won't even show up in the calendar of this user. And that's just for the non-corresponding corporate identity calendar groups. If I were to set the non-corresponding corporate identity view groups to these two groups, then that user would not be able, he would still be able to see the quote in his calendar, but he would not be able to open it unless he either belonged to the corporate identity that the quote was assigned to, or if he belonged to one of those groups. So those are some of the security settings that you can do per project element. And of course, you could go into any element, for example, the invoice, and you can give the invoice its own security settings. And they're all the same options. One example that we want to look at really quick is, say for example, you have an event folder that has certain security permissions. So right now, only administrators can view my event folders. And that's kind of an extreme permission. So let's say that only these groups can view my event folders right now. You'll notice that there is a security inherited setting as well. So if we go back to the quote settings, and if we were to say that security inherited is yes, then any quote that is a child of an event folder will inherit the security settings of the event folder. So what would happen here is that, let me go back to the quote settings. I'm not going to set up any individual quote security settings. I'm only going to have them inherit from an event folder or from a parent, I should say, because it doesn't always have to be an event folder necessarily, but it will inherit from the parent only when the quote is a child of that parent. So if I were to log in as a shop tech, remember the event folder did not have shop techs as a view group. So if I were a shop tech and tried to click into this event folder, I would not be able to view it. And I would not be able to view any of these quotes that are a child of the event folder either. But if I were to find a quote that's just a standalone quote that does not have a parent, If I log in as a shop tech, I would still be able to view that particular quote, because remember, the quote doesn't have its own security settings right now. It's only inheriting the security settings from a parent if the quote is a child to a parent. So that's what the the security inherited setting will do. So I'm going to switch these settings back just so it goes back to how I'm used to it. And then the last thing that we want to look at briefly is how you can set some security settings for your workflows. We get a lot of questions from customers asking, how can I make it so only a certain security group is able to confirm quotes or is able to generate invoices? And the way that you can do that is to set certain what we call executor groups to each workflow action. So for example, let's start from if we're in the confirm status, and this workflow is just set up by default. Again, yours might look a little bit different if you have set up your own workflows differently, but this is just the default workflow settings. So when you're in confirm status on a quote, you have an option to flag as ready to invoice. Maybe you want everybody to be able to execute this action. If it's their quote, they can do it. Or maybe you only want, I want executor groups. Maybe you only want administrators to be able to do this action, accounting, or sales reps. So a shop tech could still open the quote, still view the quote in confirm status, but when they get to the flag is ready to invoice workflow action, they will not see that option in the menu for the quote. And the only groups that will see that action and the only groups that can execute that action are accounting, administrators, or sales reps. And likewise, if a quote is in ready to invoice status, then maybe you only want your accounting and administrators group to be able to actually generate an invoice. And you don't want to give that workflow action ability to your sales reps or any other group. So if I were to open a quote, and this one right now is in inquiry state. So let's move through the workflow really quick. And remember, when we are in confirm status now, the only groups that can execute the flag as ready to invoice are administrators, accounting, and sales reps. And since I'm logged in as myself and I'm an administrator in my system, that option is there. But if I were logged in as a shop tech or any other group that was not included in the executor groups, they will not see this option. So I'll click flag as ready to invoice. And now, just to show what this actually looks like, because again, I'm in the administrators group, so I have all options. Let's actually log out and log back in as, I believe the user that I'm going to use is a shop tech. They might be a sales rep, but either way, they are not included in either of the groups that were executor groups for the quote. Oh, that's my calendar. Let me switch to calendar. We'll open this quote. Remember, it's in ready to invoice status now. And we don't have any security settings set up right now that will say that a shop tech or sales rep can't open the quote. So that's why I was able to open it just fine. But now you can see that the generate invoice workflow action is not there. Because again, we set the executor groups to only administrators and to accounting. And so that's a really great way that you can go. I probably don't have access to my workflow with this user, so let me log back out and log back in as myself. But that's a really great way that you can restrict certain workflow actions from being executed by certain groups. In fact, you might even go through your workflow and say that almost every single workflow action in the quote workflow, you could go in and say, I don't even want just anybody able to confirm the quote. I only want that to be sales reps, administrators, or accounting. And so you can click through every single workflow action that you have and assign those to a particular, or you can assign particular executor groups to those workflow actions so that only those groups will be able to execute those actions. And so these are just a few ways that you can beef up the security in your system that don't necessarily rely on the permission settings here. Because some of these permissions are a little bit broad, like the can view project elements, for example, that we looked at earlier. Since that's so broad, we've given the opportunity to go into each element and fine-tune the security settings for those elements. And again, that was in the project element settings and on the security tab. And for the workflow, that was in projects, workflow, and then open whatever workflow. And you could set executor groups to each of the workflow actions. So let me post the link to our forum. I'm sure most of you probably found your way here through that link, so you might not need it. But for those of you who are joining us that have not seen our forum link, that is now in the chat room. If you have any other questions about this, then you can go to our forum, or if you have any best practices that you want to share. I know that we have a lot of power users that come to these webinars and are always anxious and willing to share what they're doing in their system. So you could go to the forum and share some of your best practices. If you do have any technical related questions, then we ask that you email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.